Welcome to Frankly Speaking Goes Live, the digital discussion format of Frankly Speaking. My name is Yael Ohana, founder and co-conspirator in all things Frankly Speaking with my partner in much mischief, Aisha Hadzibegovic. The title of our discussion today is Anti-Racist Activism in Europe Across Generations, from All Different, All Equal to Black Lives Matter. I have the pleasure today of hosting this discussion with an amazing panel of new and not so new personalities from anti-racist youth activism around Europe. I'm delighted to introduce our 6 guests. First, 3 activists currently involved in anti-racist activism in Europe or anti-racism issues in the context of the European youth sector. Hande Taner, member of the Advisory Council on Youth of the Council of Europe's Youth Department, and representing FEMISO, the Forum of European Muslim Youth and Student Organizations, and now acting as the Advisory Council's Anti-Racism Coordinator. Maria Sulejmanova, a human rights lawyer and young Roma activist with Roma rights organizations Roma Politico and Avaya in Northern Macedonia. And Joshua Virasamy, artist, writer, and political organizer whose work intersects across political struggles and whose campaigning sits in a variety of organizations, including Black Lives Matter in the UK. And next, 3 former young people who were active in the Council of Europe's youth work and youth anti-racism work in the 1990s and the 2000s, through the first and subsequent All Different, All Equal campaigns and the Human Rights Education Program of the Council of Europe. Alana Lenton, Associate Professor in Cultural and Social Analysis at Western Sydney University and author of Why Race Still Matters, published by Polity Press. Mohamed Daler, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Manager at Cumbria Fire and Rescue Service in the United Kingdom. And Gavin Titley, Senior Lecturer in Media Studies at Maynooth University in Ireland and author of Is Free Speech Racist, also with Polity Press. Welcome to you all, and thanks again for taking the time to join our discussion today. The idea of this discussion goes back to a different conversation that Alana, Gavin, Mohamed and I had late last year, no longer being young, but having at some point been rather active. Our likes are occasionally asked to reminisce about our involvement in the first European youth campaign against racism, All Different, All Equal, which rolled out about 25 years ago. Yes, I did say 25 years ago, which we all enjoy, of course. But then Alana pointed out that more meaningful would be to dialogue with young people and activists currently involved in anti-racism across generations, so to speak. So being frankly speaking and not shy of a good discussion, Aisha and I took it upon ourselves to organize that. And so here we are. So without further ado, we'll jump right into our theme, which has 2 related parts. First, we'd like to hear more about how each of our guests sees the continuing challenge that racism poses for young people from different communities. And second, we'd like to talk about what you see as the potential of European youth work to contribute constructively to combating racism at a time of increasing authoritarianism, a resurgence of right-wing extremism, and of continued deathly violence against BPOC, despite its manifest depoliticization. So starting with you, Maria, you are a young Roma activist and maybe also a Roma youth activist. I know that in the community there can be a nuanced difference and people sometimes prefer one or the other. Tell us some more, please, about your involvement in youth work and in anti-racism, and how you see the challenge of racism for the young people of your community.
First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation and to be part of Frankly Speaking. I really like the idea, and I would love to frankly speak actually on this topic. So as you mentioned, I am working in an institute which is called Romalitico, and I'm also part of a civic movement which is called Avaya. I would like also to add here regarding the Roma community that we have several movements like Avaya in different countries. We also have a movement in Bulgaria, we have in Serbia, in Italy, so in Spain, in Romania. So we have more movements like this, and what we do is we also interact among each other, and we also have meetings so to discuss the challenges that we are facing. What we do actually in Avaya is we work already more than 2 years. We are very active on political campaigns, but as you said, also we are very much involved in racism issues. And speaking about the Balkan, I would like also to emphasize that racism is considered to be not very much a topic because racism is not understood like the same as like, for example, in US or in the countries of the European Union. So our role is actually a bit different and maybe more difficult when it comes to racism. And what we are trying is actually to show, first of all, to show that racism exists, and second, of course, to fight against that. And when it comes to my community, we usually refer to the term anti-Gypsyism, which we consider to be the root of the problem. And again, I have to mention that the Balkan is still even not at the beginning of, unfortunately, recognizing that kind of racism, but hopefully, following some of the examples of the European Union, we will, I hope, in few years, be on the stage at least of recognizing, and maybe our countries also recognizing some of the working definitions. When it comes to the challenges that we are facing, of course, we have the racism in many levels. First of all, what we can see is the racism on the streets. We have a couple of cases on which we are working, which include police brutality, which include physical attacks of Roma children. And we are still working on the outcome of that. But what we do as a movement, we usually try from each of these cases to have some outcome for the whole community. For example, we had a police brutality case in September, and what we tried to do is to advocate to have actually more Roma police workers in the country, so that we actually fight against that racism with more employment. I would like to mention also the virtual world. What is going on is that unfortunately, in this period when we have, let's say, more presence of the Roma activism in the virtual world, we can also notice that we have also negative comments coming towards us, towards the movement, or in general coming towards the Roma community. Then we have the institutionalized racism, which is very known, and unfortunately we also have the racism that is coming from the political bloc, which is, speaking about my country, maybe it's not recognized as racism, but as a negative pointing out to the Roma community. Because what we have in my country is that, of course, when speaking about certain issues, it's prohibited to emphasize the ethnicity. But when it comes to the Roma community, then some of the politicians they don't mind doing that. But speaking broadly, actually, of course, as a Roma community, we face the challenge that is coming from the populism and from the right-wing populists. Because we also have a huge number of Roma living in Hungary. We have a huge number of Roma living in Poland, in Italy, and in the other countries. And as we know, now the topic of right-wing populism is coming back to stage. I mean, it's always here, but especially now in this period when these three countries that I mentioned, Hungary, Poland, and Italy, are trying to come up with something new on the European level and maybe create some new bloc, unfortunately. But the problem here is that they of the tools that they are using. And this is the manipulation, this is the scapegoating that we could see present in their campaigns, targeting specifically the Roma community. That was happening in the previous years in Hungary. I would, if I have a few minutes, I would like also to mention the challenges that we have more actually in the virtual world. But I guess this topic will come up again so that we can discuss it more.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Maria. We'll certainly come back to that again. I'd like to come to Joshua now. You're involved in several political struggles and movements. Not all of them are youth movements per se, but they have mobilized young people. And I'd like to ask you, on the one hand, whether you identify with anything of what Maria has said already, being in a different context in the United Kingdom, and at the same time, I'd also like to ask you sort of what you see as the main concerns of young BPOC and their main demands in relation to racism and anti-racism in Europe today.
There's big questions. Thank you for inviting me as well. It's good to be in this conversation and to be thinking across Europe and intergenerationally. It's something that we don't do a lot of in the UK, to be honest. We're not very good at thinking of ourselves as across Europe. And obviously we voted to leave Europe, but that kind of thinking actually pierces lots of different movements. We think of ourselves as an island, but we are definitely connected. I think there's lots of similarities. And I mean, actually, Gypsy, Roma, traveller communities are facing high levels of persecution in Britain. And actually there's a new bill being pushed through by the government, the police courts sentencing bill, which is just being pushed through as actually seeking to further criminalize the way of life for Gypsy, Roma, traveller communities, actually criminalizing using trespass laws to disable their ability to actually set up their home. So there's lots of similarities. I think in terms of the challenges of racism, you know, when you sent that before and I was thinking about how to go through it, the amount of things that come to your head is just like, I had to just sit and write it down because it was like, there's so many fronts upon which people are being attacked in their day-to-day lives. And coming out of what happened last summer, there was a lot of big protests last summer. As you said, I've been involved with an organization called Black Lives Matter UK. We've been kind of organizing, mobilizing, and trying to shift the discourse around racism for several years now. We do that in a number of ways. You know, as Maria said, we also do a lot of kind of awareness raising, whether that's in kind of community events, whether that's going to universities or to colleges. Actually, a lot of the time we try to utilize the mainstream media, try and get our voices into the conversation. For example, yesterday we were in a lot of the public conversations around the trial and the verdict in the George Floyd trial. But we also do a lot of mobilizing for street protests, and through those create space for our own narratives. So a lot of what we do, but also what we're going to be doing is shifting. out of last summer, what a lot of people are talking about, what a lot of young people are talking about, and what a lot of their demands are around, and what a lot of anti-racist activist demands have been around for a long time, is kind of the multiple fronts that I was alluding to, the multiple fronts on which racialized communities are facing more and more like marginalization and violence from the state. So I think it is important to kind of outline some of these ways, because this new government is ramping it up in a very, very big way. So there's that bill that we're speaking about, which I don't even know where to begin with that bill, but in many ways it is a direct reaction to a lot of the protests that happened last year. So in terms of the challenges of anti-racism, maybe I'll just start the other way around. One of the examples that comes out of that bill is they're going to be criminalizing the ability to protest. So a lot of people attacked the kind of symbols of colonialism, of racism, of, you know, kind of the way that this country celebrates its colonial history. And, you know, and that ties into, we have a very similar thing here with the execution of far-right populism. And actually this government kind of leans on a lot of that kind of proto or post-fascism, however you want to call it, that kind of cultural pessimism and this idea of cultural loss that is just absolute BS. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear, I always accidentally swear. So for example, lots of people tore down those statues last year. That was a really big movement. I remember that kind of it was unprecedented. Like friends I grew up with being like, oh, I found this sign nearby, we should go and take it down. One of the things that they're doing is they're criminalizing that massively. So you can get 10 years for defacing statues. And that's where there's kind of this, you know, that kind of far right populism is actually translating into actual criminalization of people who are challenging it. There's that, it also just further criminalizes the ability to protest. There's loads of new rules in there about, like, you don't actually have to be read the legislation that's being applied to a protest. Normally you'd have to be told, actually, this is breaking certain laws. There's an assumption that you would understand the laws of protest, which is just ridiculous. There's a whole bunch of things in there. But I mean, just in terms of the challenges of racism, I mean, COVID is obviously a massive, massive issue. Like, it's devastated our communities. The disproportionality of the infection rates, the idea that the vaccine passports, which is obviously a very controversial idea, is still being debated. And obviously the World Health Organization has said we shouldn't roll it out. We've already started rolling out as a government. We've already started to trial it in certain communities. So, and that's going to have, it's going to further marginalize racialized communities. In terms of employment, like the unemployment, there's lots of scandals around like firing and rehiring. The level of unemployment in this country is also unprecedented. There's like millions of jobs have been lost over the course of the pandemic. And in terms of Black and brown youth, like over 80% of, I think 80% of the jobs that have been lost are people that are under 30, so youth, young people. I don't know how in Europe youth is a bit, I don't know, between 18 and 35 or under 35, but predominantly young people have lost jobs, and that is highly racialized in terms of where those jobs have been lost. In terms of food, like there's been lots of conversations around food and food poverty. Food poverty has been skyrocketing. And these are things that maybe people don't conventionally link to anti-racist struggle, but actually anti-racist activists are at the forefront of these struggles, talking about food poverty, talking about school meals, talking about deaths in custody. We've had like very, very high profile deaths in custody already this year in this country, two in Wales. A lot of anti-racist activism is actually focused on education, specifically thinking about exclusions, the level of exclusions from school, a lot of it, again, highly racialized exclusions from school. This new bill that's coming in, the one that I mentioned, is going to introduce secure schools. So basically youth prison schools that are going to be privately run. And it's no coincidence that these new schools are being, one of the first ones is being built next to a large historic traveler community. So there's yeah, and then part of what also happened last year is the government has released new guidance for teachers about how you can teach about racism. So anybody effectively kind of outlawing the ability to teach anti-racism, because if you teach victim discourses, then you're advised not to teach victim discourses. This is in direct response to a lot of the educational work that's happening out of the protests. And I mean, I could go on and on and on. There's the Sovereign Borders Bill that's coming out. Again, kind of targeting a lot of the work that happens around immigration is around kind of supporting migrants, is around assisting people in making their asylum applications. This new sovereign borders bill directly attacks that form of solidarity, that type of anti-racism work that's happening, as well as, of course, just like rolling out a whole new attack on migrants, like criminalizing arrival. So basically automatic deportations, even if you're granted asylum, simply for the way that you arrived into the country. One of the things that we think about a lot in Black Lives Matter, we think about the day-to-day life, we think about immigration, but we also come from an internationalist tradition. So we think about how imperialism, actually Britain's racism has an imperial nature. One of the new bills that's recently passed is the Overseas Operations Bill, which effectively decriminalizes torture. It puts armed forces above the criminal law. So there's so many fronts and so many challenges, and it's kind of hard to know where to start and where to stop with it. And I think the government, we'll come to it later and hopefully we'll have time to talk about it. But in terms of the government and the state, the media's response, it's absolutely flat. It is simply just denying, disrupting, destroying these movements. There's no engagement with it. You know, we just had the Sewell report that came out, and that was, for a lot of people, that was just like absolutely shocking. It said Britain should be seen as one of the bastions of racial integration. People should look to us as an example of what should be done. So yeah, there's a lot happening, and there's a lot of fronts and a lot of challenges to both day-to-day life and anti-racism as a struggle. Yeah.
Clearly, I mean, an enormous field with which any form of counter struggle has to deal with. Hande, I'd like to come to you next, because you're currently involved in the Council of Europe's youth sector, in their statutory bodies, and you're acting as the Advisory Council's Anti-Racism Coordinator, which is a relatively new position for that context, if I understood correctly. And so you have an insider view on how both youth organizations and the European institutions engage with the challenge of racism for young people. Based on what Maria and Joshua have reflected, do you see the real life concerns of young Roma, youth from other minorities, and BPOC communities as a matter of discussion? And if so, what's the upshot of those conversations in the context of the institution?
Certainly. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. It was lovely to listen to Maria and Joshua, although some parts were of course not lovely to hear, because you get realized again of how just horrible the situation can be for racialized communities. I'd like to briefly go back to my own background. As you said, I'm the anti-racist coordinator, not an advisory council on youth, but actually the joint council on youth. Sorry, I was appointed, I was nominated by the advisory council on youth. So basically the structure is that the joint council on youth brings together both the advisory council on youth, which is made up of young leaders and activists, and the steering committee on youth, which is actually statutory body of the Council of Ministers of the Council of Europe, which is made up of government representatives. So it's a wonderful structure where youth activists, young leaders, and government representatives come together to co-decide on youth policies and youth rights. The reason why I'm there is because of FEMISO, my own organization, the Forum of European Muslim Youth and Student Organizations. This year we've been existing for 25 years. It's our anniversary year, and it's a network organization of national Muslim youth and student organizations, ranging from the UK all the way to North Macedonia. Actually, we have a member there too, and we have over 30 members. We've been, throughout our existence, we've been very much focused on both the grassroots, so empowering our members, and at an institutional level, working to represent young Muslims, but also ensuring that our rights and freedoms are protected. And throughout this, we've developed very good relationships with the Council of Europe. We were involved at the very early stages of the All Equal, All Different campaign, the No Speech campaign of the Council of Europe, and actually recently Gavin and I worked together again on a new addition to the All Equal, All Different campaign. So that was very nice. It's very nice to see you, Gavin, here.
Thank you.
I'd like to have a brief anecdote from an internal meeting that we had of our organization, in which we also invited older generations to our meeting. And one of them said that at the time of the foundation of FEMISO, actually, Muslims, it was before 9/11, and it was obviously the situation was very much different at that time. That person said that Muslims were not seen as a minority as such. So Muslims were not necessarily seen as the other, or as we are actually seen right now. And both the perception that Muslims had of themselves, young Muslims especially, was that we had a valuable contribution to give to Europe, and that was seen as something incredibly special and unique. But the more the situation developed, let me just put it lightly like that, and if you see like a historic timeline pass, we see that Muslims, as together with many other groups, were racialized more and more and more. And that's why Islamophobia is recognized as a form of racism, in the sense that it's the product of a long process of social construction of a group as a specific race, to which certain specificities and also attributes characters are attributed. And in this case, it's the real or perceived belonging to a certain religion, which is then taken as a proxy for race. So that's why Islamophobia is a form of racism. But I think I could say that maybe 25 years ago, Islamophobia might not even be known as a concept, or that Muslims could be seen as a racialized group which can be subjected to racism for the sheer fact that they belong to a certain faith group. So this is just a reflection from my side. And I'm involved for about 5 years in FEMISO, and also in European level in anti-racism work. And it's really the work in FEMISO that opened my eyes to how much actually solidarity building is required, how much that you cannot take a silo approach to tackling racism, to just focus on your own community and on your own issues. And it's incredibly important to actually recognize the different challenges and the different problems of other communities. And that's why I'm really happy that different communities here are represented. Because, as I said, Islamophobia is a product of a process of social construction, and that same process, maybe not in the exact format, is applied to other groups as well, which leads to a product of racialized communities and brings together many other problems. And I think one of the biggest challenges right now is the sheer dehumanization of racialized groups, the sheer dehumanization of Muslims as human beings. And in this talk, I'd like to just bring the focus, the highlight on the situation in France at the moment, because the legal process is going, where the so-called anti-separatism bill, in brackets, is at the Senate now. And the Senate brought more amendments to the separatism bill, where they just want to ban religious symbols from minors. Can you imagine that? They want to securitize minors who are under 18 years old. And this time, actually, my colleague in France told me that this time they were very specific about mentioning the hijab, which is normally not done in France. It's always a general approach taken that religious symbols altogether are bad. But here, specifically, the hijab was mentioned as something oppressive, as something that should be banned definitely. That just stops me from understanding. I just can't put my brains to how this can be possible. Dehumanization is the only possible answer that can come up. And I'd like to also bring this in a broader European context, where for me, I see a huge responsibility at especially the European Union institutions. The Council of Europe is a bit different, but the European Union has a much more political and legal mandate that can be enforced by member states. When we see one of a few horrible things happening in Poland and Hungary, such as fundamental rights violations, but also violation of the rule of law, the European Commission, the European institutions, the European Parliament itself, although it was not an easy process, at the end there was some sort of process of triggering Article 9 of the Treaty of the Foundation of the European Union, and this shows that there is a willingness and there is a possibility to actually sanction member states for what they do to their citizens. But here it just seems that France has just a free pass to do whatever they want to their citizens. A free and blatant targeting of Muslims is seen as something normal. I'm originally from the Netherlands myself, and another interesting way to look at this is how international media, so international media, but also national media, the different countries report on these issues, on issues of racism in other countries. And I know the Dutch media, for instance, there's barely any reporting on what's happening in France. It's ridiculous. There's only maybe a little bit of reporting on the corona policies, or on opening up schools, etc., but nothing on how the fundamental rights of a massive community are just blatantly violated. And I just cannot put my thoughts to it. Again, from a European institutions perspective, it looks like it's a free pass, and this shouldn't happen. So the dehumanization, the political free pass, but also defamation of Muslim youth activists, not just Muslim youth activists, as I said, just activists in general, anti-racism activists, how easily they can be defamed and attacked and be put in a context where they are not to be trusted, they're lying, or they have a double agenda. And this is something that we, especially when it comes to Muslim communities, we are very much used to, that Muslims can pose a Trojan horse, and they have a certain, they have a double agenda of it's many studies have been done about this, but unfortunately both the media and policymakers and public speakers actually continue repeating this narrative. There's lots of opportunities, however, to tackle all of these issues, and I'm not sure if you're going to ask this further, but I do see the possibilities. But maybe I can end here by saying that because of my experience in Femiso, because of the way that we worked together with many cross-community organizations and cross-faith also, because we're a faith-based organization, interreligious and interfaith work is very important as well. Because of this, I actually personally, on behalf of Femiso, together with my colleagues in the advisory council, pushed for this role to be created in the joint council, that an anti-racism coordinator is to be created. And this is actually the first time that such a role is created, it exists in the joint council on youth. And since I am the coordinator and the joint council agreed to adopt me, I was free to actually shape the role a bit more. And I can freely say that that we had our statutory meetings very recently, in which I presented my report. I can freely say that one of the important values that I try to embed in this role, because I'm not going to stay in the role forever, right, is that there is a solidarity approach, that there is a holistic approach to anti-racism work, and that whoever comes to the role doesn't just take a silo approach to tackling anti-racism issues. There is a specific focus on 4 types of racism, which is Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Gypsyism, and anti-Black racism or Afrophobia. But it's really important that there's a holistic approach. And another component that I added to shape this role is the connection to actually grassroots activists, to youth organizations, to organizations that themselves actually are on the ground tackling these issues, because it's very easy to continue doing this type of work at an institutional level disconnected from the grassroots. But I really try to embed this in the role, and I'm happy that there's a positive feedback within the Council of Europe on this role. But I really hope that we can take this forward much more successfully. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hande. I'd like to come now to some of our less young panelists. Maybe Mohammed could take the next question. I wonder, how do the perspectives of the young activists that have just presented sort of the fields of work they're working in and the kinds of organizational strategy and struggle that they're engaged in, how do the perspectives differ from the ones that were current in previous generations of anti-racist youth work you were involved in, also at the European level? In which way, maybe you could also, in addition, say something about how your thinking about racism has evolved since the time when you were an anti-racist youth activist.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. And I suppose it's a poignant day today because it's Stephen Lawrence Day. Commemorating Stephen Lawrence and the way he died and everything that went wrong. And I suppose that really says it all in terms of what have we learned in the last 30 years since his death and the report came out, and what has changed. And as Josh talked about earlier on, we had a report, the Sewell report last week, which tried to say we don't have institutional racism. in this country. So for me, there's the activism, anti-racism activism is very similar across the generations. If I was thinking back 30 years ago when I got involved in youth work at a local level, it was very much around the anti-racist work. And at that time there was funding, the UK government had funding specifically to work with young people from ethnic minority backgrounds, which they call Section 28. But again, you had Scarman in those days. So again, those sort of issues have never gone away. And my involvement in youth work in those days, and it still has been around how you engage people in the outdoors and the countryside, in terms of taking them out walking, and so on. And for me, very little has changed, and youth work for me has actually gone backwards. I remember again in my day, and I edited a journal called Shabab, which was produced by National Youth Agency in those days, which was purely focused around Black youth. And in those days, Black was sort of used as a political expression in terms of including all those communities who suffered racism. So, and that sort of approach to youth work doesn't exist anymore. And the networks that existed in those days, where youth workers from those different communities used to come together, share experiences and strategies in terms of addressing and working with young people. I sort of think about, and I still use it and reference it, a book, again, NYA published by Vipin Chauhan, called Beyond Steel Bands and Samosas, which was again talking about anti-racist youth work. Yeah, and this is going back into the 80s. So for me, in some way, structurally and institutionally, that sort of movement has gone backwards, because when you look at the youth service now, it's literally sort of disappeared off the face of the earth. It's very much small projects, very locally funded, that try to survive on year, almost hand to mouth sort of thing. Well, what can we survive another year? Whereas before it was very much built into local authority, local government structures, and also voluntary sector Black youth groups got that support as well. So I think in some ways there's a movement backwards, but in terms of sort of, again, in terms of the anti-racism activism, whether you're looking at Gypsy Roma, and again Josh mentioned the bill that's coming through. I now live in an area where we in Cumbria, where in Appleby we have the horse fair, which attracts in the region of 20-30,000 Gypsy Roma travelers here, and it's been going on for over 100 years. But again, every year there's a challenge in the racism that comes out from the local community, that sort of propagates, and again, you can do as much as you like, but it's always there, year on, one after the other. So the issues for me hasn't changed. I think that some of the language has changed over the years. For me, one of the biggest challenges, I think, has been the lack of sustainability. That there's been things that, like, we were all involved, particularly our older selves. We were all involved in the first campaign and other campaigns back in the 90s, 2000s. But how much of that actually sustains itself and carries on, the lessons that have been learned? And for me, that's, I think, one of the biggest failings, that we're not sort of actually building upon that history that we've had, that we almost end up starting over and over again, rather than sort of thinking, right, we've done some work, let's sort of build on that and move forward. And I think some of the sort of innovation that we had back in the 90s is not there at the moment. And whether that because people are afraid to take those risks or what, but it's sort of how we engage in that innovation to sort of again, it's like Handa said about sort of how do we have that collaboration and solidarity between different groups and communities to tackle both anti-racism but inequality as a whole as well, because one sort of, we're talking about anti-racism, but it also feeds a whole range of other inequalities as well. whether you're looking at homophobia or a whole range of other things. And it's about how we sort of build those alliances to work together on those sort of areas of work, rather than sort of all working separately as well. So I think there's room for a lot more collaboration and innovation, but also, so I think there's an importance of building on that sort of history. But I think we also need to sort of recognize that we have these sort of reports and recommendations, but how much of that is actually acted upon? Yeah, you can sort of go back and say, even in the UK, the conversations, you had Scarman, you had Lawrence, you've had Lammy, you've had Rocky Bennett with mental health and health services and discrimination within those and institutional. But what has actually changed, and why hasn't it changed? What is actually needed? Because it almost sort of feels like, even with what's going on now, that nothing's going to change going forward. It's going to be status quo, and it's about how do you almost sort of change that whole political environment to actually challenge those conversations. I remember when I was involved in that sort of European structures and stuff, the way some of those conversations were politicized, and how certain representatives from some of the countries would almost sort of veto some of the activities that we were trying to pursue. So I think there's a lot more work to do, but there is a lot of similarities in terms of what's been going on. But I think there's a lot to work together on and learn from each other as well, to build on into the future in terms of where we go next.
Thank you, Mohammed. I'm curious to hear maybe what Alana would say with regard to what's changed now, because she was also involved at a similar time to Mohammed, but at the same time has moved on into the academic sphere and studies the phenomena of race and racism, and through lenses of activism and anti-racist action. So I'm really curious to hear how you would respond to what Mohammed has said about nothing has changed, or the issues are the same, and at the same time we haven't really learned from the past.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for inviting me. And it's been really interesting listening to everybody. And I think I'm gonna try to do something a little bit different to Mohammed, because I think, yes, in many ways nothing has changed, and in many ways things are even more oppressive than they used to be. And I think when we started out doing this work in the early 1990s, the structure was different in terms of our access to information. So I think many of us were much more naive. Speaking for myself, maybe not everybody, but I think it's fair to say that there was a naivety born of the fact that global communication was lesser. We didn't have access to the kinds of information that younger people have today. And so I'm in awe of a lot of the younger activists who are speaking here today, and many with whom I have regular contact, just in terms of the breadth and depth of their knowledge and the breadth and depth of their determination to struggle against these structures in a connected and solidaristic way. So I'm quite positive that despite everything that everybody's facing, that there's a huge amount of energy coming from young people that's embedded in a kind of a very solid and staunch commitment to overturning structures of oppression that, again, tries to avoid the kind of siloing that Handa spoke about. I think we're emerging from a period, I don't know, I don't want to put a time on it, but maybe it's to do with the demise of political blackness that Mohammed spoke about, which was a kind of a UK phenomenon, but which I think there were versions of it also when we think in terms of the multicultural optimism of Europe of the early 1990s. There wasn't so much this idea that you had to speak necessarily from your position as racialized as X. So myself and Yael got involved in this kind of work through Jewish student groups, but very quickly, I think I can speak for you as well in saying that we very, very quickly understood that it was insufficient merely to speak about the Jewish experience and anti-Semitism, but for that to make sense, it had to be connected up to other struggles. But it was still encased in this relatively, maybe naive is a little too strong, but a relatively kind of optimistic and hopeful outlook in terms of multiculturalism and sort of learning from each other and, you know, culture as the field in which this could happen, which I think got very quickly kind of overturned through our experiences. And so that we kind of grew up really, really quickly when we were faced with the kinds of institutional pushback that Mohammed spoke about from the states, the governments, who had absolutely no interest in this. And they were really about sort of trying to throw us a few crumbs while at the same time being very, very sort of committed to a kind of let's say, a nationalist agenda in which racism was always going to be, you know, not really believed. It was going, or if it was there, it was something that happened, something that wasn't really to do with state structures and institutions and systems. It was more to do with individual behaviors and prejudices, and that maybe could be tinkered with through a bit of better education and that kind of thing. And so I think we grew up really quickly through understanding that. And that's when the kind of the multicultural outlook and the kind of the steel bands and samosas approach was very quickly understood not to be enough. And, you know, indeed, you know, as you'll know, together with Gavin, we've also done a lot of academic work looking at the so-called idea of multiculturalism being in crises and what that's led to. So coming back to the youth activism today, what I think has happened, going through this kind of this period of sort of negativity in relation to that hope that was held out for this. Think about, you know, 1989, the early 1990s, the fall of the Berlin Wall, this kind of idea, you know, completely confected, but this idea of this new brave future that we were all going to walk into together, literally hand in hand, you know. Very quickly we saw that the structures were remaining in place, nothing was really changing, and people kind of retreated into what we're calling these silos. But what I think is always really, really important to emphasize about this is that these are reactions to an onslaught by the states and structures and institutions of the kind that Hande spoke about, looking at Islamophobia, but also anti-Black racism, anti-Roma racism, and so on. There's this idea that things will get better, but actually people see that things stay the same. So people retreat into, you know, let's call them safe spaces. And I think now what's happening is a resurgence out of that. So it's sort of a very quick and rapid understanding that what we need is the kind of internationalism that Josh spoke about, an understanding of race as embedded in colonialism and imperialism, and as Europe, what that means, which is something I think was absent almost completely from the conversation 25 years ago. We just didn't think about it. Or at least obviously people were thinking about that, but they were not involved in the structures that we were involved in. And so I think when things start working today, they work much more quickly because the understanding is there, the scaffolding necessary to actually see what, you know, to have mapped out in front of you what the problem is, and then to gather people together across difference to do something about it. So I think I'm learning a lot from listening to younger people.
Great. I mean, I think in some respects, Alana, you've characterized what many of us still involved in the youth sector in a policy or in a research capacity have identified as this kind of depoliticization now, and how that's been creeping along in many of the international and European youth work contexts. I'd like to come to Gavin now, because Gavin has been involved, how would I say, in some respect as a studier of what we've just been talking about, right? Gavin has accompanied the Council of Europe's youth sector in particular through, you know, numerous manifestations of its anti-racism work, through the human rights education program, through work we've done together some years ago about intercultural learning and its application in European youth work in the context of the Council of Europe. So I'd be really interested to hear from you, Gavin, what you think, where you think we've come to with you know, European youth work's understanding of itself and its task in terms of racism and anti-racism, right? How has, I mean, not only the evolution, but where are we at now?
Well, thanks, Yael, and thanks everybody for really, really fascinating contributions, which makes me wonder where to start and how not to go over some of the things that have been so well said. I mean, I think the question around, you know, the last exchange between Mohammed and Alana is very interesting there. And it's a way of bringing Hande's role into it, and then maybe situating myself a little bit in how, after a sort of, you know, I suppose, period away from practically being involved in youth work over the last while, I've been involved again in this, marking this 25 years of All Different, All Equal. And I think it would have been, you know, sort of more honest in some ways, if that Council of Europe project, honest is the wrong word, but sort of more accurate, if it were to be described in the terms of this seminar, which is 25 years since All Different, All Equal to Black Lives Matter, because there's no doubt that the impact of Black Lives Matter and the way in which those kind of seismic transformations and translations of that energy across contexts to bring out the precise nature of racialized politics in different European countries last summer, and the ways in which there was that sort of, everybody will remember this dynamic, I think, you know, where European leaders were lining up to say what happens in the US is terrible. That's the real racism over there, and that needs to be opposed. Police violence is really terrible over there, but police violence in France, police violence in Denmark, police violence in the UK, well, it doesn't exist, and if it does, it's not racism. So there was this sort of this moment where you had a kind of political energy that was saying, on the one hand, we must recognize that there is something called racism, but at the same time, it's not here and it's not what you think it is. And that created a very kind of particular political tension. And one of the responses to it, I think, was within this sort of Council of Europe Youth Directorate, such as it is, to say, the work we have been doing, which has been historically, we have pinned to or indexed to anti-racism in a number of ways, is inadequate. We don't have a relationship with the movements which are now on the streets in the context in which we work. We don't have an adequate analysis, never mind a shared analysis, which informs the kind of work that we're doing. Therefore, in looking back over the last 25 years, it's not just a retrospective, but it's also some attempt to try to regain some kind of relevance in relation to the kind of moment that Black Lives Matter created. And so I think that that's the context in which, you know, the work that many of you in different ways, and myself and Hande mentioned it there, Alana, yeah, you've written for this piece as well. I think that's the context in which it came out of. And so I think it's very interesting for me, even if I don't know the institutional background to it, and we can ask Hande about this, that for me, it's very interesting that the role is called an anti-racism coordinator even. Because if I was to tell the story, since our involvement of thinking about anti-racism in the European youth scene, it is one, as you've mentioned, Jael, of absolutely deliberate depoliticization, moving away from a moment that Alana and Mohammed talked about, where for all the narrowness of the understandings that informed action, there was something called anti-racism, to a very, very sort of deliberate attempt to redefine that away from being a negative politics into a kind of pro-diversity, pro-multiculturalism kind of thing, which we've talked about many times. Now, obviously, you know, some of the energies that informed that are the energies that we have today. In the 1990s, it was very much as well that the threat was from the authoritarian populist right and the far right, and that should never be underestimated, both politically and on the street. But this was also a way of state-led and state-related bodies saying, the state doesn't exist here, there's nothing to see here, we're not going to talk about bordering, we're not going to talk about state racism, we're not going to talk about policing, we're not going to talk about socioeconomic inequality in the way in which it's racialized, and so on. So, you know, there's a similarity between now and then, but within that, there's been a cycle, I think, that we could look at in terms of, perhaps if we want to call it depoliticization and some kind of repoliticization. So that might be something interesting to come back to with Hande later on, to see whether you think that that's, you know, that's one of the reasons why we can talk about anti-racism again in that context. I think to try to, I mean, it's a long story around some of the things that you've asked, Yael, and I don't want to take up too much time, but I think what I could try to trace a kind of continuity in a way. It seems to me that one of the things, to add to what's been said here today, one of the things which is happening and which, you know, is very much there in Josh's contribution and in Hande's contribution, is that there is a concerted form of backlash against anti-racism. And there's very specifically a backlash against the anti-racism of younger generations and young people. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, clearly this sort of, you know, it's obviously not a post-COVID moment, because we don't know what, you know, what COVID and future COVIDs are going to look like and what they're going to do. But there's a moment in which, as the emergency, very I mean, uneven emergency responses. The map is very hard to talk about, but let's say across sort of the, you know, the Council of Europe at the moment, there's a diminution of the crisis moment. And what's very, very clear is that there is significant awareness of the role of socioeconomic inequality, of precarity, but also of the racialization of inequality and precarity within these societies. It's very, very clear that people are very much aware of that. And it's very clear that the conditions for action are becoming possible again. But at the same time, one of the things that many governments have done is they've left in place, or they've augmented many of the kind of emergency measures which have been used during the COVID period as a way also potentially of keeping the lid on social protests and so on. So one of the things that really I think marks the moment right now is a concerted backlash against Black Lives Matter and anti-racism in general. And the way that that's being conducted, there are obviously very significant differences between, you know, the nature of enthusiastically state and intellectual-led Islamophobia in France versus the very sort of opportunistic way in which the Tory party is going about this in Britain, as Josh was speaking about, and has written about this in The Guardian as well, this kind of politics of distraction with that the Tories are so adept at. But you can look at it in other countries as well. But what's going on, I think, is this. It's to say, we recognize that there are problems, but what you're doing is excessive. What you're doing is defining everything as racism. What you're doing is in the things that, you know, I've been interested in defining everything as racism. You're positioning yourself as victims, you're shutting down freedom of speech, you are actually the ones acting undemocratically, and therefore we need to find ways of pulling you back into line before you become a democratic problem. And in different ways, that is being the structures for that, but also the discourse for that are being lined up in different countries at the moment. Now, we can trace those kinds of backlashes backwards, right? I mean, it's not hard to find, you know, in the same year as the Selma to Montgomery march, American Republicans were talking about anti-racism having gone too far in the United States, you know, 4 years before the Civil Rights Act. So this stuff has continuities, but it's being used very much, I think, in the sort of interim COVID moment right now to stamp down on generational activism. And it's also being done in ways which bring in the questions, you know, that have been raised about coalitions, not just coalitions among sort of racialized communities, but if you look at the way in which this backlash is being set up at the moment, it has a strong element of anti-feminism. It has a strong emphasis on anti-trans politics as a way of recentering, you know, the family and the nation and a certain kind of patriarchal order. It has a strong element of homophobia, which in many ways has sort of overtaken this sort of you know, celebratory appropriation of gay rights that we were associating with sort of, you know, Islamophobic racism a few years ago. So a lot of that kind of stuff is lining up, and it's going to target now anti-racist activism. So I think that's where we are with that now. And I think what that does is in many ways show us that, you know, a lot of, as Alana was saying, a lot of the approaches which we associate with European youth work in that period are just not relevant to the social reality. The question is, to what extent were they ever relevant to the social reality, or was there always a gap between the way in which methodologies allowed people to talk about and bring their social realities into it, which I think is one of the strengths of that work. But one of the weaknesses of that work was that the tools and the concepts that we had were really not just inadequate, but actually sort of the very terms which were the very terms and concepts which are the basis of reactionary politics. And obviously this is something myself and Alana have written about a lot, and I can come back to later, but I won't linger on that now. But I think that, you know, we are in a moment of repoliticization, but we're also in a moment of very, very significant backlash. And that backlash is contextually quite different, but it's very transnational. And these actors learn from each other and they know what they're doing, and therefore we need to respond appropriately.
Thanks, Gavin. I'm actually wondering what Hande thinks about this, because she is embedded in those structures, and she does have an overview of those conversations, or the conversations that might be taking place either between organizations in the advisory council or between youth organizations concerned with these issues and governments. So I suppose the upshot of my question to Hande is, do you think that, you know, in view of what Gavin has said and those observations, do you think that the structures can actually ever become anti-racist?
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think at the very basis of this just lies the recognition of youth work, and lies the recognition of the importance of young activists and youth organizations do. the fact that, for instance, I was able to join the advisory council and represent FEMUSO and all the experiences that we have. Again, FEMUSO's experience is very much rooted in cross community and interfaith work, from which we learned a lot of these values, such as holistic approach and having no silo approach. Being able at the advisory council, of course, brought those grassroots experiences and observations to a more institutional level. So that's actually something very important. I had to think of the question, of Gavin's question, and I took some notes. And I had to think of the term politicization again, because I have very much contradictory feelings about it. The more contradictory feelings about the observation that right now there's some sort of repoliticization. Because when we look at the manifestations of racism itself, I see them as highly political. I see how the French government targets Muslims and Muslim youth as just a highly politicized nature, especially when we consider that the whole world is in the middle of a global pandemic. Students cannot go to universities, but the Minister of Education of France thinks that Islamo-leftism is the biggest threat to campuses. How that just doesn't line up in my brain. I don't know about you, but so this looks very much political, and it gives me the feeling that anti-racism, or the manifestation of racism has always been political. But I think I'm trying to better understand. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding from my side. I think maybe we were talking about the repoliticization of anti-racism work. Yes, that's right.
Exactly.
So exactly. Sorry. So I think the more I talk to myself, I should do this more, the better I understand it. The reason behind the name of the title of the role itself, again, is multifaceted. The fact that the advisory council itself internally spoke about this, the bureau itself, we talked internally about creating the role, and there was widespread support for the creation of the role, already shows that there was solidarity amongst 30 youth representatives and 30 youth organizations for the creation of such a role, because youth are much more active on the ground. We're more at the forefront of different movements, and I think we are more open to understanding cross-community issues. So the advisory council's support and recognition of the voices of minority youth and experiences is incredibly important, but at the same time, the role itself doesn't just come out of nowhere. It builds up on previous work of the Council of Europe itself, builds up on different anti-racism work, mainly discrimination, because from what I've actually gathered internally is that there's not a specific focus on tackling racism itself, but more general approach to tackling discrimination, which is very much different than having a specific approach to racism. But again, still, there are many important legal documents, political documents, and work that has already been done in the Council of Europe upon which this role actually built. Plus, very important, I think, is a specific role that the Council of Europe has done on tackling anti-Gypsyism. On tackling anti-Gypsyism separately, but also integrating Roma youth. There's massive and incredibly inspiring, important work done by the Council of Europe on actually supporting Roma youth on one side, and tackling anti-Gypsyism as a form of racism, and on the one side. That like the role itself builds up a little bit on that as well, on that work. Plus, of course, there's the element of time and the fact that in the past few years, very important, big, sad events also happened, such as the death of George Floyd, the many protests of Black Lives Matters in Europe itself, in European capitals, gave much more legitimacy to the role itself. Christchurch happened, even though it happened in New Zealand, it gave a much more visible face to the deadly character of Islamophobia. And also the fact that the Christchurch terrorist itself, I must note, was actually radicalized kind of online through networks which were based in Europe. So it was not completely disconnected from Europe itself. The many actually anti-Semitic happened both in the US and in Europe. The Halle attack and different in Germany, and different really sad actually developments that directly affected the lives of people, which all of this was incorporated in the description of the role. Because if you look at it from a procedural side, how such a role should be created, as you internally speak about it, either the steering committee or the advisory council. So from in this role specifically, it came from the advisory council. You give a description of the role and why it's important to try to convince the joint council to vote in favor of it. And all of these aspects were incorporated, both the work of the Council of Europe and the sad developments I just mentioned. So it's a mix of a more, I think, recognition of the importance, as I said at the beginning, of the importance of youth work, youth organizations, the experiences of minority youth, but also the internationalism, as Josh mentioned. I'd love to go back to it, that all of these things are just incredibly interconnected.
I'd like to come back to Maria and Joshua to ask sort of how they see the very specific dimension of youth activism in the struggles that they're involved in the kinds of work and anti-racism action that they're involved in. Do you see a specific role, or do you think that it's not really about young people? It's not really about the youth dimension. It's much more about something else. No? Maybe Maria, you could take a stab at that.
Yeah. Thank you for your question. Well, I think that young people, they play a big role actually now, because we have the COVID-19 pandemic, and what we all expect in this period is actually to see some great changes that will come after, right? So post-pandemic transition, we are speaking about new era. So these are the new things, right? And because of that, but also because we always need that youth energy in fighting racism, I think that youngsters are currently playing a big role, and that in the future, of course, they will have to take the lead when it comes to dealing with these new things that we expect them to come in the future. Because I also, when I started to speak previously, I said that we have the racism going on in the virtual world, and that's a real challenge, right? We all see that happening. We have these different platforms that we spend as youngsters, I don't know how many hours per day. And with the pandemic, we are more in this virtual world than that we are, outside with people. So we see that we have a shift in our communication, and of course, I'm sure we already feel that, but in the next future, I expect this shift to be even greater, because of this huge presence actually on the internet, and I can connect it with the decision that was brought yesterday by the European Union on actually it's a new proposal for a regulation of the artificial intelligence. So connecting the past, the present, and the future, the youngsters will have a crucial role. Because they are the ones that understand this social media. They are the ones that should understand this artificial intelligence. Because if we have the racism now going on the streets, we have now racism on internet, but we are going to have that racism, unfortunately, also in this software. So this is what I expect, unfortunately. And this is maybe the reality, if we speak frankly, right? So, I mean, as one of the solutions, what I see until now, it's actually feeding more the internet space with positive content. So as a way of fighting this racism that is going on online. And of course, when it comes to new softwares and new machine learning stuff that are going to be implemented in the future, I think that this is actually the correct time to actually search for a place also in that area. Because if we as minorities or different groups are not involved from the beginning, that we are going to face another crisis.
Thank you, Maria. A lot of food for thought there. Joshua, maybe you'd like to come in and comment on what Maria has said, being at the forefront of some of these political struggles and engaging with young people who are involved in the movement, regarding the sort of the specific youth dimension, and regarding sort of young people's mobilization and so on, or maybe also with regard to some of the things that Alana and Gavin have said earlier on, please.
Yeah, it's a big question. I think when I first got involved with politics and stuff, it was around the time of the massive student protests in Britain. And then, of course, like the massive youth uprising, what people call the England riots, which was almost unprecedented in scale and unprecedented in the criminalization of it by Keir Starmer, nonetheless. But I think if we look at politics, just politics generally in Britain, I think it's always shaped by youth. Even if we look at the kind of insurgency of the Labour Party, like that was attached to what people call the youth quake, and that openness to the kind of anti-establishment politics of, because Corbyn was an anti-establishment ticket for a lot of young people. I think that's because there's also been years and years of like anti-austerity organizing over the last decade in this country. I think actually youth, the scaffolding that Alana's speaking about, obviously a lot of it is previous movements, and a lot of, we have a rich tradition of anti-racist organizing in this country, and the Race Today collective does as one example of it, does inform a lot of the political thinking of youth. But also we have been doing the scaffolding work over the years, and because we have a lot of connection to our histories and to knowledge through the internet. So I think actually it's always been going on. And then the youth strikes, the youth strikers of 2019, 2020, and then like the last seismic moment was one of the biggest protests of last summer. So I think like actually I'm quite optimistic about youth activism and the future of it. And I think the kind of work around this bill is really demonstrative of like where it's going. There is a coalition between Gypsy Roma traveller activists, between sex workers who are being criminalized by who are going to face this kind of new Nordic model coming in, between people who are organizing around education and people who are organizing around protests, traditional protest movements. People are coming together, and again, the character of this is really important. And there's a long conversation that can be had around why it takes this character, but it's explicitly extra parliamentary. The movement's talking about this stuff being beat in the streets. It's not saying that we don't need to work within the political infrastructure. It says that work is important, and a lot of the NGOs that are tackling that kind of space are attached to this movement. But I'm quite optimistic about its strategies and its thinking, and it's like kind of working together. And I would also like Hande to speak about internationalism. I think one of the reasons why Black Lives Matter UK as well specifically is so tarnished, and the defamation is I've had a lot of the right-wing press come for me and come for my family, come to my family house and stuff. And I think a lot of the defamation and a lot of the explicit kind of targeting of Black Lives Matter UK specifically as an organization is because we are anti-imperialist and because we are internationalist, and they beat us with the McCarthyist stick of like these are neo-Marxist groups. I think there is an issue that we don't really have that strong current of anti-imperialist internationalism as it existed in the 70s, 80s, 90s here. And I think that has a lot of reasons. I think after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think a lot of the kind of like international communist movement went into retreat, and actually a lot of the infrastructure that we needed to kind of bring us into this international movement wasn't there. But there's lots of reasons why that doesn't exist. And actually, I think maybe I don't know a lot about the council and the European Youth Council and all that, but I think there is maybe a role to be played in kind of thinking about how we do that at a European-wide level, because it does need to be on a European-wide level, because NATO has a lot of European members, and when we think about imperialism, it has a very European character to it. So I'm quite optimistic about that. And yeah, also I guess like just a quick note on the politics of last summer was incredibly and not just anti-systemic, it was abolitionist. That was what was on a lot of the placards, and that is the defining the trial. Derek Chauvin was sentenced, but everyone's like, that's not enough, because the character of that moment is actually abolitionist in its nature, which means that it's going for the jugular of the criminal justice systems. And I think that the defund the police being a slogan is such a massive step forward. And I think that's actually, obviously is to do with the long work of abolitionist thinkers and movements in the States. But that coming here, and I think actually that being part of it is attached to the extra parliamentary bit, is attached to actually, like, I'm super optimistic about all of that, and actually that filters down into a lot of the local organizing that groups are doing. And then when I speak to a lot of the youth activists, they call me big bro, so I'm like, am I youth anymore? But like a lot of these guys are 15, 16, and they're like organizing groups. But I guess my last point with that is it is profound, and like when I go to their meetings, I'm like, when I was getting started, I was nowhere near as knowledgeable as you are. They're like quoting Thomas Sankara to me in a way where I'm like, oh my God, I didn't, and this like really young. But what is missing for me is this kind of like, we talk about institutional racism. I think we need to have institutional anti-racism, and this kind of like existence of, because a lot of us look back at our communities. I grew up near Southall, which was like a really important bastion of anti-racist struggle across Britain. And it's funny to think about how much of it was a hive of activity that went across generations there. And then like when I grew up, there was nothing. And that's the same for so many communities. But so I look back at it and I think, wow, there was institutions, there was generational carryover, there was supplementary schooling, there was a massive connection to internationalist discourse. Like we were, our journals were interviewing the leaders of revolutions in the decolonization struggles. And so I think I'm not saying that, because a lot of the character of these movements now is decentralized and they don't want to have that kind of democratic centralist kind of, a lot of the carryover of that kind of traditional organizing. But there was infrastructure, and that was really important. There was physical spaces, that's really important. And like Alana and many people have said, a lot of the degradation of that is the state coming in and very, very smart, in a very smart way, kind of funding different operations and putting money into different communities and splitting that movement, bringing new characteristics into forms and But I think that's something that I think that's something that's very important and we need to come back to. And I think, again, like European institutions can play a really fundamental role in thinking about how you scaffold that kind of rebuilding of anti-racist infrastructure in the community, and something a lot of us are speaking and thinking about as well.
Thank you, Joshua. I think you've gone some way to starting to think through sort of the role that youth work could play in the context of the anti-racism struggle, because exactly referring to that infrastructure, those meeting spaces, the role of civil society, initiative groups, support systems for young people to get involved, and so on and so forth. And you've also talked quite a bit about what it might take to repoliticize European youth work, right? You've mentioned a number of things that could be discussed, applied, dug into deeper at the level of the European institutions and youth organizations and structures that do exist already at the European level for supporting youth work. I wonder what other new ways of thinking about youth work, maybe also as education, because there is this one dimension of the anti-racism proposition of European youth work, which is very prominent, which is this idea of learning across cultures, learning with each other, building solidarity and trust, confidence building measures, and how you know, the non-formal education contributes to that. And non-formal education, civil society support programs contribute to that. So I'd be really interested in hearing from any of you about which kinds of new ideas or ways of thinking about education in the anti-racism space could be of let's say, relevance and could be promising, and how European youth work could consider developing those. Now, if you see any potential inroads into that, and for that, I let any one of you take the floor, whoever would like to.
Yeah, I think personally, I think non-formal education youth work has a real important role in anti-racism education. But I think it's how it's actually built into that non-formal curriculum, because it can't be called intercultural anymore. That's going to change, and it's going to be a lot more overt in terms of what it's about and how it's delivered. And I think there is another element to this as well, in terms of who are those youth workers delivering it. And I'm looking at what's the racial diversity of those structures and institutions. You look at the youth centers, you look at the Youth Forum and ECB in our days and CENIC in our days. There was no racial diversity, and it still isn't. And until some of those structures change and we get some of those BIPOC youth workers in those systems and structures and in those leadership roles as well, that then you get a diversity of thinking. Because at the moment you've got the same thought process, predominantly white Anglo-Saxon Europeans who were in those sort of roles, who were having those conversations. And then we might have, and it's brilliant to see that there are roles being created like the anti-racist coordinator, but we need people above that and beyond that. And where is that structural change? Because I think that's where we've really sort of missed out. It's fine, sort of, it's almost like throwing crumbs at us to do things around anti-racism education, and almost a real clear curriculum. It's like sort of in the UK when Ripon brought his book out, that was sort of quite a piece of work in terms of defined anti-racism youth work and what anti-racism youth work should look like, and that move away from, and that's, when you think about it, that's going back in the late 80s, but defined that sort of move away from multicultural into that anti-racist approach. So I think there needs to be real clarity in terms of what we want to achieve. But I personally think youth work has a real role in terms of that whole anti-racist movement and empowerment and that enablement. And I think there is optimism in terms of the future, because we have whole sort of range of young people active in different ways. But that sort of that non-formal education needs to be clear alongside the formal as well. And that's another big challenge and debate alongside the non-formal. But that non-formal really needs to have that real sort of core curriculum in terms of what it's about. And again, those discussions, whether it's youth work competencies and so on, is anti-racism built into those competencies in that sort of European framework of youth work. And it needs to be sort of really structured into that whole system to make that change.
Thanks, Mohammed. Actually, that picks up on something I'd like to ask Gavin, because Gavin has been involved in the revision of educational materials lately, around the materials that were produced in that time. The All Different, All Equal Education Pack was the seminal work on anti-racist work in the European youth context. And rereading it now, sometimes honestly, I cringe. Yeah, and not because all of a sudden we're all so woke, but because really, if you think about it, and this has been raised by several of you, that kind of imperial zeitgeist and that coloniality is still so very much present in so many of the activities that are outlined there. And so I think the question to Gavin, and maybe anybody else who would like to ask, who would like to answer it, is sort of, what would it take to decolonize our canon of educational materials? What what needs to change in that canon, right? And here I'm really talking about the sort of you know, non-formal education, intercultural learning, anti-racist youth work, all of that stuff.
That's not a small question. I suppose one starting point would be an obvious one, and you know, something that I think we've all learned a lot from Alana's work in relation to, which is that at a certain point we've got to stop talking about anti-racism and talk about different anti-racisms and the relationship between them, and that comes across a number of, you know, across a number of dimensions. One is obviously the way in which particular racisms racialize particular populations as the problem in particular ways, and that has contextual aspects. But the other is, of course, the politics of different kinds of anti-racisms. You know, in other words, what do they see as the problem? How do they define the locus of the problem? What do they think transformation or emancipation or amelioration or management or whatever is as a kind of some sort of transformational goal, if there is a transformational goal. So I think that one of the things that defined, you know, or characterized rather the broad anti-racism education space of European youth work was that there was always an interesting tension between the sort of people who were there and the things that they wanted to do, and the formal possibilities of the institutions and their programs and their ways of thinking about anti-racism as a dimension of human rights education or human rights mobilization, intercultural learning, and so on. So, I mean, one of the things that was always interesting for me about the youth centers and the work of the European youth programs was that things were happening there which were, you know, not quite clandestine, but they were somehow different from the assumed headlines that they were meant to be taking, you know, that they were taking place under, because it depended on who you had in the room, and it depended on their politicization, and it depended on what they were involved in. So that was always a kind of a great potential. And I think given some of the things that we've been talking about now, that potential is probably even more important. But I think that's a slightly separate discussion from what we could realistically expect institutions of a particular kind to commit to or to recognize as a mode of anti-racism. So the sort of, you know, the Council of Europe approach to anti-racism as sort of organized through something like intercultural learning is quite good in, for example, in terms of thinking about the sort of the socialization that we undergo, particularly a kind of white socialization and its relationship to, you know, who belongs and who's legitimate in the nation, and the way that nationalism is organized, and the way in which nationalism reproduces forms of exclusion which are racialized, these kinds of things. That was always a kind of a great strength. But it was never very good at you know, obviously the things we've talked about, at thinking about imperialism, at thinking about the continuation of imperialisms through forms of, you know, bordering and migration policy and this kind of thing. It was always quite good at looking at the ways in which cultural difference could be used to racialize and to, you know, prosecute certain kinds of politics, but not very good at taking a step back, as we know, and saying that part of the problem is the centrality of culture in the first place, the way in which European institutions think about culture as the main explanatory mode for the organization of prejudice, discrimination, and so on. So for me, you know, and again, I say this as somebody who's, you know, as we found out so far, too old, too woke, but you know, admittedly too distant from these things to say much of use to people involved in the structures today. But I think that that's sort of the possibility that comes from the milieus and the networks that are created within a kind of unique set of institutional possibilities, that remains valuable. But I think there's still an awful lot of work to do to really think about what's feasible and how useful that is when it comes to institutional modes of anti-racism. And I think what Hande has said has been very useful in that regard. But you know, but it's always been laden with tensions as well, right? I mean, it's very difficult, as she knows very well and has written about, to even talk about Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism in the context of the Council of Europe, say with the influence of France. Very, very, very difficult to do. So we have to maybe, I think, sort of, you know, evaluate what we think is realistically possible. And maybe that's okay, you know, maybe in other words, because we're talking about multiple fronts, we're talking about, you know, multiple levels of struggle. This happens here. We also know what happens in communities on the street, and maybe sometimes they overlap and maybe sometimes they don't.
Thank you, Gavin. Does anybody else from our panel wish to take up that particular question on sort of decolonizing the canon?
I just wanted to pick up on some of the things that came out also, something that Josh mentioned, and then what Gavin was saying in relation to, Josh, you used the terminology of institutional anti-racism, and I thought that was really interesting, because I think there's a slight problem here, which has been pointed out by many people, activists and scholars in the race critical space, and particularly I'm thinking about Indigenous activists and Indigenous scholars, about what does decolonizing mean, really. Okay, so I live in Australia, as you'll know today, and Aboriginal activists will say, well, decolonization means land back, right? That's what it means. It doesn't mean anything else, right? It doesn't mean anything to do with the curriculum. That's just your little gloss that you've put on it. And I think that reminder is really, really important, right? So the thing I worry about is what happens when the institution itself says, we are going to do this, okay? We're going to decolonize, or we're going to make ourselves anti-racist. And and I think Handa is extremely, I think you know exactly what it means for you to be placed as an anti-racism coordinator, and the limitations of what you could do within those structures. And the best that we can hope for, I think, are those kind of anarchic moments that emerge, and we've all had those experiences when you're at the youth center, and as Gavin said, the right kind of constellation of people come together and something anarchic happened. It happened in 1996 with the Shabab Aqaliyat conference, when we brought together different racialized groups, with Jewish groups, Muslim groups, Black people, and LGBTQ people into a space for a week. And it was something anarchic happened, right? It wasn't always easy. There were conflicts, but so what the institution can do is provide a space, and then what happens in that space is what the people there do with it. But once the institution decides we are, from our top-down position, going to decolonize, or we are going to be anti-racist, this is when the alarm bells go off in my head, right? So although we want it to, but we're also nervous. And this is what pushed me out of the Council of Europe campaign stuff that we were doing. So after the campaign finished in 1995, I kind of had, we were talking about this when we had our sort of chat last year, I almost had a nervous breakdown, because I was like, there is something so odd about this, and something so uncomfortable about trying to do this work from within this imperialist structure, right? And it led me, eventually into studies, and then into academia, which is its own kind of colonial apparatus, right? So, and in these structures also, the best we can do is try to create these little pockets of freedom, these kind of fugitive spaces that people talk about for kind of subversive study, or active subversion for kind of trying to shift things in some kind of small way. So I'm always there with my warning sign up of what do we mean when we talk about decolonization? What do we mean when we talk about the institution doing anti-racism?
This is really, really interesting. I know that Hande wants to come in, and then Josh, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to round it up.
Amazing, Elena. Thank you so much for that. I was very happy when Josh mentioned the institutional anti-racism. I was like, that's exactly what we need. But then when Alana brought another perspective, I thought maybe that's not what we need. So it's an incredibly fragile situation where you both need structures in place that do recognize the existence of racism and do recognize the role of institutions to tackle racism, which is, for instance, something that ENAR does, the European Network Against Racism. They're very much working together with its members to push their own governments to create MAPAR's national action plans against racism, which could be argued as a form of institutionalizing anti-racism a little bit, which is putting basically the responsibility on the government side of tackling racism. But of course, there's a huge risk there that the institutions themselves then define the needs of communities, which is exactly what the threat is here. Because one of the points that I wrote when you asked the question is what can be done to decolonize institutions or this work, is the first thing that I wrote is to just listen to the communities themselves, what they face and what they demand or what they need, and to really give the ownership to the whole process to the communities that are being affected themselves. And I think once this is not done, or it's done in a really wrong way, then things go just wrong. Things are just even more threatened. For instance, I can say that the European Commission a couple of years, I think about 5 to 6 years ago, they created 2 roles. the Commission Coordinator on Anti-Semitism, and the Commission Coordinator on Anti-Muslim Hatred. Because of my work, we've actually solely worked together with the Commission Coordinator on Anti-Racism, and there I can very honestly say that the approach or the understanding of the issues, or and both the implementation of processes, including the involvement of Muslim communities themselves, was lacking at many different fronts, which at the end actually negatively affected Muslim communities themselves. And I think this shows just the importance of giving ownership to the communities themselves, plus also making sure that the youth perspective is always there. This is something that we always push for as FEMISO, that the youth perspective in anti-racism is always represented there. It's always there because the youth perspective is just different. Youth are more at the forefront of activism and community building. So yeah, I think that maybe if I can end with another point is the funding processes. Funding processes, if you look at the whole financial side of community building and youth work, is many of them are actually based in getting grants and different types of funds from different organizations and foundations. If in these funding processes, if anti-racism is seen as a specific priority itself, then of course there's a huge actually step made in support of supporting anti-racist youth work. Because what happens is that youth work itself is incredibly underfunded, or youth organizations themselves. And once they apply for funds, such as to the European Youth Foundations, they have to adjust their whole program to the existing priorities. But if anti-racism is not amongst them, then they try to put it in a framework of intercultural work, for instance, or interfaith. Let's hold hands and pray together. Be the case.
I was just thinking, I mean, one of the things that feels important is, and maybe it's a bit selfish, but like we don't have enough spaces to kind of share, to kind of pack more power into the punch of the narratives that are coming out of different struggles across Europe. You know, like if we could actually be able to speak from a place of like really being informed and understanding the exact narratives around like Islamophobia, the people who are fighting Islamophobia in France, or who are fighting anti-Gypsyism in certain parts of Europe, like a space to really share our discourses and really kind of hear, and like, so that it's happening at the same time, we'll just pack a lot more punch into our discourses, and that is a big part of what we're doing in our movements. And it was really, I want to kind of find out more about that conference that you were talking about, Alana. And I was recently listening to a talk by an academic called Vijay Prashad, and he was talking about like the importance of conferences in anti-racist struggle over periods of time, and anti-imperialist struggle, and kind of how a lot of those really important conferences of the nature of that time have kind of drifted away. And I think, I mean, whether it could happen in a space like for what with the spaces we're talking about, it would be so important. It's so important to kind of, one, bring together these European struggles, but also to bring them into communion with struggles that are happening in the global south, like whether that is farmers organizing in India, or people organizing in northern Syria, not just to kind of be like, hi, how are you, what are you up to, but actually to share strategies to really deepen that, because it needs to happen at a European wide level, and we need to be in conversation with those struggles that are happening to really build an actual sense of anti-imperialism. So I feel like that is part of the education work. There used to be a lot more delegation and a lot more movement between anti-racist movements in Europe and the global south, and I feel like that has faded away. That feels important as well.
Thank you, Josh. So the thing we do at the end of every one of these sessions is that we talk about famous last words. In other words, if you had the opportunity to speak frankly to maybe to Europe, or to, in our interest is the European youth work sector, what would you say? And I'd like to hear from everybody who would like to contribute.
I think we need structural change, and then we will have some long-term impact. Until then, it's not done, but yeah, structural change for me is my last famous words.
Frankly speaking, ownership should be given to and rooted in the minority communities affected themselves.
Well, my two famous words would be empowerment and diversity, because I would really want to see more colors in Europe and in the European structures.
I would simply say, you know, if I'm talking to institutions, to recognize that you are political, you're not outside of it, and you're not facilitating it, and therefore, you know, to echo what Alana said, there's an honesty sometimes in being conservative and in being realistic. You know, don't take discourses that you don't know what to do with, or that you don't understand, or that you don't honor, but rather provide spaces if you can provide them, provide resources if you can provide them.
Yeah, I suppose I'd say to Europe, you know, stop thinking that this is a problem from somewhere else, that this is aberrant, or that it's only about, you know, extremists on the fringes, and understand that, you know, Europe is the birthplace of race, racial logics, and racist structures and practices, and be honest about that. And from that will flow the other changes, the structural changes that everybody's calling for.
What to say beyond what's already been said? Absolutely, that we need to have systemic change, like Mohammed said, and just kind of reiterate what Alana said, that Europe and the European nation state and the function of it and the origin of it has everything to do with what we're talking about, even from the Enlightenment up until now, like, and even has its own problems with talking about the Enlightenment, but absolutely what we're dealing with is the European nation state, and we have to make space to think about its structure, how and why it proliferates, and how it can disappear.
So thank you so much, everybody. This has been such a rich discussion. I wouldn't even, you know, even attempt to sum it up. It's just been an absolute pleasure, and as always, I'm always so impressed with our, you know, just with how the communities themselves are engaging, stepping up, showing leadership, and you know, doing the hard work. You know, we've heard about stuff today which is really hard work, and it's a credit to you all that you're doing that. And well, what I hope for is that you know, this conversation will kick something off, will you know, get people thinking. We'll try to put it out there into the world, and hopefully we'll get some frank response. And so thank you very, very much for joining us today, and we look forward to hopefully speaking to you and seeing you again, maybe even in person sometime soon, somewhere in this Europe or in this world, or in this virtual space. So take care, and thank you very much.